Christians thought that the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was more reliable than the Hebrew. They accused Jewish folks of having altered the Hebrew so that it would sound less Christian, because their Septuagint sounded more messianic, because it was translated in a period when Judaism was a lot more messianic. And so this lasted until around the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century CE, when Jerome was translating the Vulgate, and he advocated for returning to the Hebrew. He made the case that it was more reliable than the Greek, and that it was actually the Greek that had been altered. And so he translated the Hebrew Bible from the Hebrew, but did not have Hebrew manuscripts for the deuterocanonical books, the Apocrypha. But because the Septuagint collection was still considered authoritative, he wanted to include them. So he translated them from Greek into Latin, and the Vulgate would become, for the Roman Catholic Church, the authoritative edition of the Bible for over 1,000 years. And then what happens at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation is a Dutch humanist scholar named Desiderius Erasmus produced the first printed edition of the Greek New Testament. We now refer to this as the Textus Receptus. But this allowed translators of the Bible into vernacular languages like German, like English, to go back to the Greek of the New Testament rather than to translate from the Latin translation. And so Martin Luther did this, and William Tyndale did this. And Luther also wanted to return to the Hebrew of the Old Testament, but there were no manuscripts in Hebrew for the Deuterocanonicals, which up until that point had just been interspersed throughout the Old Testament. So what Martin Luther did was translate the Hebrew manuscripts that were available from the Jewish tradition, and then move all of the Deuterocanonicals into a separate section and translate them, but treat them as a separate corpus of texts. And initially, he wanted to reject them, but ultimately they were included in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So the first Protestant Bibles included the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, and the New Testament. And this includes the early editions of the King James Version. And then in the 19th century, Bible societies, particularly the American Bible Society and the British and Foreign Bible Society, began to more regularly print editions of the Bible that omitted the Apocrypha, and this made for shorter and easier to carry and cheaper editions of the Bible. By the end of the 19th century, that became the standard within Protestantism. And so when we get the Revised Version, the first major revision of the King James Version that actually began to use the critical edition of the New Testament rather than the Textus Receptus, the Apocrypha was not a part of it. And so ever since, Protestant Bibles have traditionally omitted the Apocrypha. So today, if you pick up a Catholic Bible, you will see the Deuterocanonicals, the apocryphal books, scattered throughout. If you pick up a Protestant Bible, you usually won't see the Apocrypha at all, but there are editions, particularly the New Revised Standard Edition, that include the Apocrypha. And Catholic Bibles also were influenced by the Protestant Reformation, and so they now base their translations of the New Testament primarily on Greek manuscripts rather than the Latin manuscripts as well. So the main difference is really whether or not they have the Apocrypha in them.